He came in from the west, through cloud so low and thick it was more fog than sky, with the motorcycle beneath him shaking in the cold. Sirius had always loved this bike. He'd loved the speed of it, the stupid fool, the roar of the engine, and the way it cut through silence like a blade through cloth. And Hagrid thought of that now. Sirius' face above the handlebars, grinning wider than any face had a right to, and had to look away from the thought before it cracked him open entirely. He had already been crying for an hour. The cold air had dried the tears on his cheeks almost as fast as they came, and somewhere over the Bristol Channel he had given up trying to stop them. It didn't matter. Nobody was watching. The Muggle world was dark and sleeping below him. A few lit windows, yellow and small and utterly indifferent to the enormous man on the flying motorcycle and the bundle he was carrying against his chest. He looked down at it now. Just for a second. You weren't supposed to look at this height. You were supposed to keep your eyes forward, watch the cloud, pay attention. But he looked anyway, because it was nearly the last time. The baby's face was round and pale, tucked between the lapels of Hagrid's jacket, and it was peaceful, the way sleeping faces always are, the way sleep has no memory of what has come before it. There was a smear of soot across one cheek that Hagrid had tried to clean and failed. The hair black, already sticking in every direction, already defying every law of lying flat, was his father's. And in the center of his forehead, just above the brow, there was a mark that had already stopped wounded, already hardened into something permanent. A shape, like a bolt of lightning, raw and red against the pale skin. Hagrid pulled his eyes forward. He flew on. The street was everything Dumbledore had said it would be. Perfectly ordinary, perfectly neat, the kind of street that existed in defiance of anything interesting. Even from above, it radiated a certain bland certainty of itself, all identical gardens and identical curtains, and a silence so thorough it seemed enforced. He came in low over the rooftops and set the motorcycle down at the curb of Privet Drive with barely a sound. He had expected darkness. It was dark, yes, dark the way it gets at 3 in the morning when even the cats have given up. But there were 2 figures already at the garden wall of number 4, and one of them was Dumbledore. You could always tell Dumbledore from a distance, the height, the silver of his hair very long, catching even the barest trace of light from a sky that gave nothing back. He had his half-moon spectacles on and his hands folded before him, and he was watching Hagrid come up the street the way he always watched things, with that patience that was either very calm or very sad, and you could never quite decide which. The other figure resolved, as Hagrid reached the gate into Professor McGonagall. She had been the tabby cat on the wall. He'd been told she would be. She was 46 years old, and stood as though she had been waiting not 3 hours, but 3 years, her dark hair pinned back with an exactness that seemed almost defiant at this hour, her face doing the thing it did when she was furious. "Hagrid," she said. Not a greeting, not a question. "Professor McGonagall," he said. His voice came out too large, then too rough. He swallowed and tried to hold himself together. Dumbledore said nothing. He held out his arms. Hagrid had known this moment was coming. He'd known it the whole way across the country, had felt it approaching like weather. He looked down one last time, because he was not built for not looking, because the alternative was to simply hand over the boy without acknowledging that there was a boy, and he couldn't manage that. The baby was still asleep. Still with that soot smear. Still with the scar. Still with the black hair that was going to defy gravity regardless of what world it was growing up in. He walked forward. He handed the bundle to Dumbledore. He did not know, afterward, if he had said anything in that moment. He remembered the weight leaving his arms and what came in its place, which was a kind of hollow he didn't have a name for. "Bless him," he said finally. because he had to say something. "He's so little, Dumbledore. He's just so—" The sentence went somewhere he couldn't follow it. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and stood at the garden wall in the dark and shook. McGonagall spoke. She had been on this wall since before dawn, watching number 4, watching the street, watching everything she needed to watch in order to make her case, and all of it was in her voice now. "You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us," she said. "And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, howling and screaming and throwing himself about." She did not look away from Dumbledore. "Harry Potter, come and live here. It's the only way," Dumbledore said. He said it simply, as he said most things that were not simple at all. "He has his mother's protection. It will keep him safe while he is here." McGonagall looked at him. She did not argue further. This was its own kind of argument, Hagrid thought, to look at someone and say nothing. To let the silence hold what you could not say to your headmaster in a dark street at 3 in the morning with the boy already in his arms. "How did you get here, Hagrid?" Dumbledore asked, as though they had met for tea. "As though this were an ordinary night." "Flew," Hagrid said. He gestured at the motorcycle waiting at the curb. "Young Sirius Black lent it to me. He said it the way you say a fact, plainly because it was one." Sirius had lent the motorcycle, that was what had happened. Something moved through Dumbledore's face, and then was still, a resolution already made, or a question he had already answered. He nodded once, slowly, and said nothing about Sirius at all. He turned and carried Harry down the front path. They watched him bend and settle the bundle on the cold stone step of number 4, neat and careful, with a letter tucked into the blankets, for the aunt for the Muggle woman asleep upstairs, who did not yet know that her morning would be different from every morning of her life. The garden was perfectly tidy, the house was perfectly ordinary, the stone step was cold. Dumbledore straightened. He looked down at the boy for a moment that Hagrid would remember for 40 years, and then he said quietly to the dark and the garden and the closed door, "Good luck, Harry." McGonagall turned and walked away down the street without another word. Dumbledore raised the put-outer and the lamps came back, warm and ordinary, and then he was simply not there anymore. Hagrid stood alone with the motorcycle. He stood for a while. He looked at the door. He looked at the dark. He thought about the cottage at Godric's Hollow, the way it had looked when he'd arrived. The east wall gone, the roof caved in, the smell of magic turned wrong, iron and ozone and something scorched, and James on the floor of the hall, and Lily at the top of the stairs, and the small, clear sound a baby makes when it is crying, and there is no one left to come. He thought about these things, and then he made himself stop thinking about them, because if he thought about them for one more second, he was going to sit down on the pavement of Privet Drive and not get up for a week. He got back on the motorcycle. He did not go to Hogwarts. He knew the ministry building the way you know a place you filed paperwork in, not with affection, but with enough familiarity to find the door. There was a sub-office off the Charing Cross intake, a small room, staffed overnight because someone always had to be, that handled incident reports, for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Hagrid had filed there before. Creature encounters, boundary incidents, a nesting hippogriff near Nottinghamshire that had required 3 separate reports and a map. They had forms for everything. He found a place for the motorcycle in the alley behind the entrance. He went inside the witch. At the overnight desk, glanced up, took in the size of him, and looked back at her paperwork, without comment. She pointed him toward the intake shelf. He took the closest form to what he needed. Transportation of a magical person, it said at the top, and sat down at the narrow table in the corner, with a pen that was entirely too small for his hand. He wrote slowly, the way he had taught himself to write. Each letter formed with care. Each word sounded out in his head before he committed it to the page. He wrote the date. He wrote the name of the child, all three of it, in letters that took up more of the line than the form had meant to allow. He wrote the identifying feature, one lightning bolt scar forehead, already healed, source known, and the origin and the destination, and the name of the witch and wizard. He wrote the vehicle used, motorcycle, flying property of S. Black, to be returned to same when possible. He wrote the authorizing party in the largest letters on the page, taking care with every syllable, APWB. Dumbledore, Headmaster, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, because it seemed like the most important thing to get right. He signed it at the bottom. R. Hagrid, Gamekeeper, Hogwarts. He put it in the enchanted intake tray. The tray folded it. The folds were brisk and precise and entirely automatic, the way a tray that folds things all night long learns to be, and the paper aeroplane that emerged was no different from any other, identical in size, in the angle of its nose, in the small, purposeful curve of its wings. It sailed up into the pneumatic tube in the ceiling and was gone, somewhere in the sublevels. Hagrid supposed it would find a drawer. It would settle into a stack with everything else from this night, from this week, from this month, all the reports and notifications and inter-office letters that ministry life produced without ceasing, and it would stay there. He rode back to Hogwarts through the grey, fraying edge of 4 in the morning, with the cold coming through his jacket and his eyes streaming from the wind and the other thing, the thing that wasn't the wind. The cloud had lifted. He could see the motorway below him, orange-lit and empty, and somewhere behind him a perfectly ordinary street in a perfectly ordinary town where a baby was going to wake up on a doorstep and cry until someone came. He didn't know this. He couldn't know this. But he would think about it for the rest of his life anyway. The way you think of the thing you weren't there for. The way you carry the weight of a bundle you no longer have. The paper aeroplane in the sub-level filing room lay flat in its stack, and was not opened again for 10 years. The files from November 1981 arrived on Amelia Bones's desk in 3 stacked boxes, each sealed with the brown paper twine of the Ministry Archive and labelled in the cramped hand of whoever had been on cataloguing duty a decade ago. She had not requested them, precisely. She had signed off on the decennial retention assessment, which was a form that required no thought at all, and the archive had interpreted this as a request, which it always did, and so the boxes had appeared. It was a quiet morning. The enchanted paper aeroplanes that carried the department's internal memos had mostly settled into their in-trays by 8:30, which was early even for a Friday, and the Aurora office down the corridor was producing only the low, steady rumble of people doing paperwork. November 1st, the kind of morning that had no strong feeling about itself one way or the other. Amelia set down her tea, pushed her monocle into place, and cupped the twine on the first box. She was not looking for anything in particular. The decennial assessment required her to identify materials for retention, materials for destruction, and materials that needed recataloguing under the updated 1988 filing codes. It was not interesting work. She had assigned it to herself because the alternative was assigning it to someone else, and she had learned through long practice that the things you assigned to someone else were the things you never quite trusted to have been done properly. Particularly for 1981, particularly for those months. The first box was procedural. Prosecution records, sentencing memos. She flipped through them with the efficient rhythm of someone who has spent many years reading things she didn't want to read, noting the retention codes in the margin with a red marking quill, setting them in their appropriate stacks. Bellatrix Lestrange convicted. Rodolphus Lestrange convicted. Rabaston Lestrange convicted. Bartemius Crouch Jr. convicted. She paused a half-second on that one, as she always did, then moved on. There were a great many names. The autumn of 1981 had been a busy season for the Wizengamot. The second box was correspondence. She worked through it more slowly, because correspondence from the immediate post-war period had a tendency to contain things that had been filed in the wrong place, and misfiled correspondence from 1981, so she read each item. Most of it was administrative. Flu access permits, beast registration transfers, a long and tedious exchange between the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad and the Obliviator headquarters regarding the Godric's Hollow deployment and who was responsible for the cost of the Muggle stonework repair. She was halfway through the third box when she found it. It was out of place immediately, visually. The other documents in the stack were typewritten on the Ministry's standard cream forms, the kind produced in the Administrative Secretary office and stamped at the top with the DMLE seal. This one was handwritten. Large letters, uneven. The pen pressed harder than it needed to be, the lines not quite following the guide-ruled paper beneath them. It was on standard Ministry incident paper, which meant someone had known where to find it, but whoever had filled it in had either never been taught the proper form or had decided not to use it. She read the author's name at the bottom. Hagrid, Gamekeeper, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Amelia sat with this for a moment. Then she read the document from the beginning. It took less than 2 minutes. She read it through to the end, set it flat on the desk, and looked at it as though it might clarify itself, if given the chance. Then she picked it up and read it again, this time with her marking quill in her hand. On the second reading, she underlined 3 things. The first was the authorizing party. The handwriting in that section was more careful than the rest, the letters larger and more deliberate, as though the author had understood that this was the part that mattered most. A.P. Dumbledore, Headmaster, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Not a ministry official. Not a placement services order. Not a signed welfare transfer. The headmaster of Hogwarts, acting on what appeared to be his own authority and no one else's, directing the delivery of a child to a private Muggle address. She drew a precise line under it and wrote a question mark in the margin. The second thing was the name of the child. She had known, from the third line of the form, who it was going to be, but she underlined it anyway because that was how she worked. Harry James Potter. Identifying feature. Lightning bolt scar, forehead. Origin, Godric's Hollow, West Country, cottage parents deceased. Destination, 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey, Muggle, relatives. There was no reference to a placement order. There was no reference to a welfare assessment. There was no ministry record number, no co-signatory, no official sanction, just a child, a ruined cottage, a Muggle address, and Albus Dumbledore's name. She wrote, next to the second underline, no ministry placement order found. The third thing was the vehicle. Motorcycle. Flying. Property of S. Black. To be returned to, same when possible. Sirius Orion Black, who had been arrested approximately November 1st or 2nd, 1981, the same night this report was filed, and who had been held in Azkaban without trial ever since. She drew a line under the name. She did not write anything in the margin beside it, because she did not yet know what to write. She set the report down. She stood up, went to the filing cabinet against the far wall, the one that held the active records for addresses currently on the improper use of Magic Office Register, and pulled the folder for 4 Privet Drive, I've little whinging. She had not expected there to be a folder. There was a folder. She carried it back to her desk and sat down and went through it carefully. The folder was thin, but not empty. 11 notifications over 10 years. 11 instances in which the trace, the detection system that monitored underage magical activity, had flagged accidental magic at that address, and 11 instances in which the improper use of Magic Office had sent the standard warning letter, and that was where the paper trail ended, every time. 11 warnings, 11 letters, 0 welfare officer visits, 0 follow-up contacts, 0 case notes from a magical family welfare officer. For 10 years, a child had been living at this address, a child the ministry knew was there because the trace had been sending them his coordinates with metronomic regularity, and the ministry's response, every single time, had been to owl him a warning letter and consider the matter closed. Amelia looked at the dates. The earliest notification was from 1983, when the child would have been 2 years old. 2 years old, and living with Muggle relatives who had never been assessed in a placement that had never been registered, at an address that appeared in no welfare record she could find. She closed the folder. She put it on top of the delivery report. She folded her hands on the desk. Across the hall, an enchanted paper aeroplane soared past her open office door on its way to wherever it was going, and she watched it out of habit. There was a bowl of green-wrapped sweets on the corner of her desk. Her niece had brought them when Susan had visited over the summer, small and cheerful and entirely unaware that her aunt kept sweets in the office at all. She looked at them now without seeing them. She was 50-something years old, which meant she had been at the ministry for long enough to know what it felt like when the paperwork was hiding something. It did not feel like scandal. Scandal was a thing you recognized after the fact. What the paperwork was hiding felt, at the time, like absence, like the shape of a thing that should be there and wasn't, like pressing your hand to a wall and finding nothing on the other side. She had felt it when she read the conviction transcripts from the First War. She had felt it when her brother's name came up in the casualty list, and there was no follow-up inquiry, no closed file marked resolved, just a page in a register and the next page after it. She felt it now. She pulled a fresh sheet of parchment. She folded it in half and creased the fold with her thumbnail, a habit from a long time ago, a useless precision in an era of enchanted memo planes. She flattened it out again and picked up her quill. She wrote to the Wiesen-Gamot Administration Services, the branch of the DMLE that maintained all records of criminal proceedings, formal trials, and Wiesen-Gamot hearings. She requested, politely and precisely, a copy of the trial record for one Sirius Orion Black, imprisoned November 1981. If the record ran to multiple volumes, she would take the complete transcript. If it did not, she would take whatever existed. She folded the parchment, the memo tray beside her desk, converted it efficiently into a paper aeroplane, and launched it before she'd finished straightening in her chair. Then she took a clean folder from her drawer, the heavy card sort, the kind she kept for cases that were going to need their own shelf, and she set the delivery report inside it, and the Privet drive folder on top, and she labeled the new folder with a marking card, and placed it at the left edge of her desk, where she put the things that were going to require her attention in the morning. She took a fresh sheet of parchment. She drew a line down the middle. At the top of the left column she wrote, in her most careful hand, Harry James Potter. At the top of the right column she wrote, Sirius Orion Black, beneath each heading. For now she left the space empty. She would know what to put there when the Wiesen-Gamot Administration Services wrote back. The response from the Wiesen-Gamot Administration Services arrived on the morning of November 5th, 4 days after she had sent the request. It was a single page. The language was administrative and precise, which was the language of the Wizengamot Administration Services in all circumstances, regardless of what the language was being precise about. The office confirmed that it had searched its records for all proceedings pertaining to one Sirius Orion Black, incarcerated November 1981. No trial record existed, no charges had been formally filed, no hearing date had been set. No legal advocate had been assigned or waived. The subject had been transferred to Azkaban on the direct order of the senior official, then heading the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, acting under the authority of the Minister for Magic Millicent Bagnold, in the immediate aftermath of the events of November 1st and 2nd, 1981. The transfer had been processed under emergency detention provisions. The file contained a detention order, a transfer manifest and a reception record from Azkaban's intake. No trial. Not a delayed one, not a closed one, not a transcript marked classified. An absence, complete and clean. Amelia set the letter on the left side of her desk, on top of the 2-column parchment she had begun 4 days ago. She straightened it. She aligned its edges with the folder beneath it. She did this carefully, the way she did everything when what she actually wanted to do was something else entirely. Then she wrote to Azkaban Prison Administration. She asked a simple question. Was Sirius Orion Black currently held at the facility, and had he been held there continuously since his intake in November 1981? She sent the memo plane off and went back to her other work, which that morning included a werewolf registry appeal and 2 separate incidents involving Muggle-repelling charms on a property dispute in Shropshire, and she worked through all of it with her usual thoroughness. The reply from Azkaban came back before lunch. Terse, institutional, definitive, Black, S.O., cell, confirmed, held without interruption since November 3rd, 1981, 10 years, continuously, without a trial. She pinned the reply under the was letter with a small silver clip and went to the filing room down the corridor from her office, the one that contained the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes Cross-Reference Archive, which was organized with the particular obscurity of a department that considered itself peripheral to everything, and was therefore rarely asked for anything. She wanted the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad's incident reports for November 1st, 1981. It took her 20 minutes to locate them. The AMRs filed by incident, type and region, not by date, and the filing codes for autumn 1981 had been entered under the pre-1984 system, which was incompatible with the post-1984 system and had never been properly converted. She found them eventually in a box at the back of the 3rd shelf, under a report about a mishap with a switching spell in Exeter, and next to what appeared to be a duplicate copy of a 1979 Obliviator quarterly report. She pulled the Godric's Hollow file, replaced the box, and carried the file back to her desk. The MRS report was professional and detailed, which was the character of the squad. They did precise work, under difficult conditions, and they documented it precisely. The scene at Godric's Hollow West Country had been attended by a team of 6, arriving at approximately 2:15 in the morning of November 1st, 1981, following notification from Magical Accident Detection. Scene summary. 1 cottage structure, external load-bearing wall on the eastern face destroyed by magical impact consistent with a reflected ending curse. Roof collapse on the eastern side, interior damage throughout the ground floor. State of the structure, secured, pending further assessment. Casualties, 2 adult fatalities. James Fleamont Potter, male, age 21. Lily Potter, née Evans, female, age 21. Both confirmed at scene. Survivors: 1 infant, male, identified as Harry James Potter, aged approximately 15 months. Infant removed from scene by R. Hagrid, gamekeeper, Hogwarts, who attended shortly before the AMRS team arrived, carrying ministry authorization from A. Dumbledore, headmaster, Hogwarts. Infant was transported by Hagrid. Destination of transport. Not recorded by this team. Muggle witnesses. None conscious at scene. 2 Muggle residents of adjacent properties who had been woken by the blast were obliviated successfully by attending obliviators per standard protocol. Amelia set the AMRS report down beside Hagrid's delivery report. She placed them parallel to each other, an inch apart, and read across them. The infant removed from scene. The infant delivered to 4 Privet, Drive, Little Winging, Surrey, Muggle relatives. One was an official ministry incident report filed by a qualified team operating under Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes Authority, cross-registered with the Auror office, stamped and countersigned and held in the ministry archive for 10 years. The other was a piece of incident paper, filled out by a gamekeeper in the early hours of the same night, in what she imagined was an overnight sub-office, in handwriting that sloped uphill. Together, they were the only complete account of what had happened to Harry James Potter on November 1st, 1981. Nobody had ever thought to hold them side by side before, because nobody had ever had reason to look. The AMRS report recorded that the infant had been removed. Hagrid's report recorded where he had gone. Neither had ever been cross-referenced. The 2 documents had been sitting in this building, in different filing systems in different rooms under different administrative codes for a decade. She sat back. What she knew as a matter of documented fact, a child had been transported from a death scene to a Muggle residential address, without any ministry placement order, on the authority of Albus Dumbledore alone. That child had been generating trace notifications for 10 years at the same address, and the ministry's response had been 11 form letters. The man whose motorcycle had been used to transport the child had been incarcerated in Azkaban for those same 10 years, without trial, without charge, without a legal advocate of any kind. She did not know, yet, whether any of this constituted wrongdoing in the legal sense. She was aware that the absence of a specific law governing wizarding child placement with Muggle relatives was a complicating factor. She was also aware that the absence of a trial was not a complicating factor. It was a fact. She knew something else. She had a niece who had started at Hogwarts in September, a cheerful girl with blonde hair and an alarming quantity of sweets, sorted into Hufflepuff, who mentioned her classmates in her letters home with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of someone for whom everyone was equally interesting. She had mentioned, in her second letter of term, a boy in Gryffindor who had already managed to fall off a broomstick and catch a remembrall simultaneously, and had described the event with such admiration. His name in that letter had been Harry Potter. She had noted it at the time, the way you note things that are not immediately relevant, and set it aside, the way you set things aside when you do not yet know that you will need to come back to them. She was coming back to it now. She did not allow herself to feel, because feeling was what came after the work, and the work was not finished. She allowed herself, instead, to be precise. She took 2 clean sheets of ministry parchment from her drawer. To the first she wrote, Headmaster Albus Percival Wulfric, Ryan Dumbledore, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. She informed him that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement wished to meet with him on a formal matter at his earliest convenience, and that she would be obliged if he could owl her directly with his availability. She was courteous, as she was always courteous, and specific, as she was always specific, and she gave him no indication of the subject beyond the phrase formal matter, because the subject would keep until he was in a chair across from her desk, and she preferred that he not have time to prepare. To the second she wrote, Deputy Headmistress Minerva McGonagall, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. She addressed this letter separately and independently, because a corroborating witness and an implicated party were not the same thing, and she intended them to receive different letters. She informed Professor McGonagall that she was writing to her in her capacity as a material witness in connection with events of November 1st, 1981, and that the department would appreciate her cooperation. She sealed both letters and sent them separately by 2 different owls at 2 different times of the morning. Then she updated the 2-column parchment and added a date to each heading. Harry James Potter, B. The 31st of July, 1980, and S. SIIS, Orion Black B. The 3rd of November, 1959, held Azkaban. Continuously. Since November 1981, no trial record. She put the parchment back in the folder, and the folder back at the left edge of her desk, and she returned to the Shropshire property dispute, which was considerably less serious and considerably more straightforward, and she worked on it until 6 o'clock. She apparated to the end of the street, not to the door, because arriving at the door was the kind of thing that startled people, and startled people were worse witnesses than calm ones. She walked the last 100 yards. It was a Tuesday in late November, and the street looked exactly as the 1981 file had described it. Perfectly tidy, perfectly ordinary, the gardens raked to within an inch of their lives, and every curtain in every window hanging at precisely the same angle. Even in November, even with the flower beds empty and the trees bare, there was something relentless about how unremarkable it was. Amelia walked along the pavement in a grey coat she wore specifically for Muggle visits. Nothing unusual about her. At a glance, nothing that would make a neighbour look twice. And found number 4 without difficulty, because number 4 was exactly the same as number 2 and number 6 and every other number on the street, and there was therefore no reason for it to be hiding. She rang the bell. The woman who answered was thin and blonde, with a very long neck, and a way of standing in her own doorway, as though she were deciding, in real time, whether to permit the door to remain open. She looked at Amelia with large pale eyes that were already on their way to wariness before Amelia had said a single word. "Mrs. Dursley," Amelia said a fractional pause. "Yes." Amelia produced her identification, a slim leather wallet, the kind that registered as nothing to a Muggle eye, but that, to someone who knew what to look for, confirmed head, Department of Magical Law Enforcement, in gold lettering. She held it open long enough for Petunia Dursley to read it, then put it away. "I'm here on an official matter," she said, concerning a child who lived at this address. "I'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind. It shouldn't take long." The pause this time was longer. Something moved in the pale eyes. Not quite fear, not quite defiance, but a close relative of both. "He's gone to school," Petunia said. "He's not here." "I know," Amelia said. "It's the arrangement I'd like to ask about rather than the boy himself. May I come in?" The hallway of number 4 was as neat as the garden, if rather warmer. There were photographs on the wall, a large, blonde boy at various ages, grinning with the self-satisfaction of a child who has never been told to stop grinning, and a coat rack, and a small table with a potted plant on it. And beneath the stairs, Amelia's eyes moved to it and away again. In less than a second, she filed it and moved on. Petunia did not offer her a seat in the sitting room. She stood in the hallway and folded her arms, which Amelia found instructive. People who expected a conversation to be brief and survivable sat down. People who intended to keep it short stood. "He came to us on November 1st, 1981, Amelia said, as an infant, left on the doorstep with a letter. "That's right, and he lived here from then until September of this year, when he left for school." "Yes." "Were there any formal arrangements made? Any documentation that accompanied him, beyond the letter? Any contact from the wizarding world regarding his welfare or his situation here?" The question sat in the air of the hallway. Petunia's arms tightened slightly across her front. "There was the letter," she said. "That was all. And the letter explained the arrangement. It explained." A pause. "Enough." Amelia looked at her steadily. "I wonder if I might ask where he slept while he was here, just so I have a complete picture." It was the question Petunia had been braced for, Amelia realized, because the reaction was already prepared. A very small, stiffening, the kind that had been rehearsed. "He had a bedroom," Petunia said, "upstairs. He moved there when he was." "A few years ago he moved there. Before that?" Silence. "I notice," Amelia said pleasantly, "the door there, under the stairs." "Could you tell me what's in their storage?" Petunia said immediately. "Just storage." Amelia smiled, which was an expression she had cultivated over many years for exactly this purpose. Warm enough to be non-threatening, still enough to be absolutely unmovable. "Would you mind if I had a look?" The door was small. She had to duck slightly and latched on the outside with the kind of simple bolt that existed in the world specifically for the purpose of keeping something in or keeping something out. She noted the bolt with the same attention she gave everything, factual, precise, filed. She opened the door. She stood in the doorway and looked. The cupboard was perhaps 5 feet long and 4 feet high at its tallest, which was at the door end, sloping down to nothing, where the stair above it met the floor. It smelled of old wood and something she associated, from years of casework, with rooms that did not get enough air. There was a mattress on the floor, narrow, the kind designed for a small person. There was a shelf at eye level if you were very short or were crouching, and on the shelf the ghost of clutter remained, a circular mark where a glass had sat, a groove worn smooth by a repeated small weight, a strip of paint gone lighter than the surrounding wood where something had rested for a long time. In the corner, almost invisible in the dim light from the hallway, there was what had once been a small drawing pinned to the wall. The pin was still there. The paper had been taken down. She looked at all of it. She did not make any particular expression. She had been doing this work for long enough to know that what she felt was not the part that mattered, and that witnesses, including witnesses who had done something, did not respond well to visible judgment, and that visible judgment was, in any case, a luxury that the procedure did not permit. She stepped back, straightened up, and turned around. Petunia was watching her from 2 feet away, with an expression that had gone very blank, the way expressions go blank when the person wearing them has decided that blankness is the only safe option. "The letter," Amelia said. "The one left with him in 1981. Do you still have it?" A longer pause. Then, "Part of it." She disappeared into the kitchen and came back a few minutes later with an envelope, old, the paper gone soft at the creases from having been folded and unfolded over years. She held it out with the careful movements of someone handing over something they don't want to hand over, and don't see a way to refuse. Amelia read the relevant portion. She did not read it aloud, and she did not comment on it. The letter said what Dumbledore had apparently said to McGonagall on the night of the protection. Lily's protection. Lily's blood, and her choice, and the old magic that her choice had activated, which required that Harry live somewhere, that Lily's blood lived too, with Petunia, who was all that was left of Lily's blood now. The letter explained with the measured thoroughness of a very intelligent man who had thought through every implication why the arrangement was necessary, and what it depended on, and what he was asking of the family in making it. The letter said nothing about a cupboard. The letter said nothing about who would come to check on the boy, or when or how Amelia refolded it and returned it. "One more question," she said. "In the 10 years he was here, did anyone from our world come to visit? Anyone who came to ask how he was getting along, or to check the conditions of the arrangement?" Petunia looked at her for a moment. The blankness shifted into something more complicated and less certain of itself. "No," she said. "No one came." Amelia thanked her for her time. She walked back down the neat front path and through the gate and along the pavement to the end of the street, and she stood on the corner in the grey November light for rather longer than she had meant to. The street was exactly as tidy as it had been when she arrived. The bare trees and the identical curtains and the closed doors of the identical houses. A very ordinary residential street in a very ordinary English town, and somewhere at the end of it, under the stairs of number 4, a bolt that latched from the outside. She walked to the end of the road and disapparated. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in early December, folded inside a standard ministry envelope with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement seal on the back. Minerva McGonagall set down her tea, read it through once, and read it again. It was precisely written. That was the first thing she noted. The language was formal and specific, with none of the hedging that official correspondence sometimes defaulted to when the writer was uncertain of their ground. Madam Bones was not uncertain of her ground. She was writing to Professor McGonagall in her capacity as a material witness in connection with events of November 1st, 1981, and she would be grateful if Professor McGonagall could make herself available at the ministry at a mutually convenient date. The letter was signed Amelia Susan Bones, Head, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Minerva set it flat on her desk and looked out the narrow window at the December grounds. The loch was dark and still, and the first of the month's light snow had dusted the lawns white, and somewhere beyond the glass her students were presumably doing exactly what first years did on Wednesday mornings before breakfast, which was mostly worrying about their homework. She had 63 years of experience and a substantial intelligence, and she was not in the habit of being caught unprepared, and she was not about to start. Now she folded the letter back into its envelope and went upstairs. The door to the headmaster's office opened before she knocked. This was not magic, or not precisely. Albus simply had a quality of attention that made knocking feel, in retrospect, redundant. She came in, sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited, and put the envelope on the surface between them. "I imagine you've received something similar," she said. "I have." He was holding a teacup in both hands. He looked, as he always looked, entirely tranquil, one of his more complicated qualities which Minerva had spent 40 years deciding was either wisdom or a very practiced performance of wisdom, and which she had ultimately concluded, "Madam Bones writes well. She writes precisely," Minerva said. She used the phrase, "material witness." "Yes," Albus said. She was careful to distinguish. "What are you going to do?" He set the cup down. He looked at her over the half-moon spectacles with those blue eyes that could, if you were not paying attention, look merely kind. "Tell the truth," he said. "It seems to me that anything else would be worse in every direction. You could have refused. The investigation, the meeting." "I could have." He didn't elaborate. She had known him long enough to understand that when he declined to elaborate, it was because the elaboration was so obvious to him that he assumed it was equally obvious to her. She picked up the envelope. I assume you are not going to tell me what to say. I wouldn't dream of it, Minerva. A slight pause. I'll only say that whatever happened on that night, the account you give Madam Bones should be the same account you gave me. She looked at him for a moment. She thought of the garden wall, and the long, cold day, and the small, ordinary house, and what she had said. It will be, she said. She went to the ministry on the Thursday. The meeting room Madam Bones had reserved was small and plain on the DMLE floor. A rectangular table, 4 chairs, a window that looked at an internal wall, an oil lamp that provided adequate, if not generous, light. There were no trappings of the Wizengamot, no elevated seating, none of the formal apparatus that Minerva associated with official wizarding proceedings. It was simply a room in which 2 people could sit at a table and speak to each other, and she appreciated the choice, because it was the choice of someone who had thought about what the meeting was for. Amelia Bones was shorter than Minerva, and square-jawed, with very short grey hair and a monocle that she wore with the air of someone who had long ago stopped registering it. She was on her feet when Minerva arrived, which was a small courtesy that Minerva noted. She gestured to the chair across from her and sat down when Minerva sat. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course, before we begin, I want to be clear about the status of this conversation. You are not a suspect in any proceeding, and there is no proceeding formally opened. You are a material witness and your account is voluntary. You are free to decline to answer any question and to have representation present if you prefer." "I don't prefer," Minerva said, "and I understand the distinction." Something in Amelia's expression registered and filed this in the efficient way that she registered and filed everything. "Then I'll start from the beginning. Were you present at 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey, on the night of November 1st, 1981? "Yes. Will you describe your presence there?" Minerva folded her hands on the table. She had thought about how to answer this on the journey down from Hogwarts, and had concluded, as she usually concluded, that the straightforward answer was also the correct one. "I had received information from Albus Dumbledore the day before, indicating that Harry Potter would be brought to Privet Drive that night. I arrived in the early morning of November 1st, and watched the street from the garden wall of number 4. I was in my animagus form for most of the day, which is a tabby cat. Madam Bones wrote this down, and you remained there until the delivery took place, until Hagrid arrived with the infant, and Dumbledore placed the child on the doorstep." "Yes." "During the events of that evening, did you raise any concerns about the placement of Harry Potter with the Dursley family?" Silence, which was not hesitation. Minerva simply believed that the space before an answer was as much a part of the answer as the words that followed. "Yes," she said. "Will you describe the nature of those concerns?" She described them. She described what she had seen over the course of the day. A family whose entire character, insofar as one November afternoon permitted assessment, was one of aggressive normalcy. The boy she had watched in the street, howling and kicking, the aunt, moving in and out of the house with the brisk efficiency of a woman who organized everything within her reach and tolerated nothing outside her expectations. She described what she had said to Dumbledore, and she said it as close to verbatim as 10 years permitted, because that was the standard she held herself to. "You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us, and they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, howling and screaming and throwing himself about. Harry Potter, come and live here." Amelia was writing steadily. She did not look up. And what was Professor Dumbledore's response to those concerns? He said it was the only way, that Lily's protection required it, that the charm her death created would hold only while Harry was in a home where her blood was present. Petunia Dursley is Lily Potter's sister, her only living blood relative. Did you understand that argument? I understood it, Minerva said. I did not like it. I made that clear, and after making it clear, you accepted it. It was not quite a question. Minerva looked at her. He was the headmaster, she said. I was the deputy. I raised my concerns to the relevant authority. He heard them and overruled me. Did you file your concerns anywhere? Submit a report, write a letter, approach anyone else? No, she said it plainly, because plainly was the only way to say it. I told Dumbledore. I said what I thought, and he said what he thought, and he was the senior person present and the one who had designed the arrangement. I deferred to his judgment. She paused. She looked at the table for a moment, and then back at Amelia Bones, who had stopped writing and was looking at her with an expression that was not judgment, which Minerva had prepared herself for, and could therefore set aside, and was instead something more like recognition. That was my choice to make, Minerva said, and I made it. I have not always been comfortable with it. The room was quiet for a moment. I appreciate your candor, Amelia said. I appreciate yours, Minerva said. The distinction you made at the beginning, material witness, voluntary account, that was carefully done. I try to be precise. So do I. Minerva straightened slightly in her chair. I notice you didn't ask whether I thought the arrangement was wrong, only whether I raised concerns about it. Yes, Amelia said. There's a difference. There is, Minerva agreed. I thought the Dursleys were unsuitable. I continue to think so. Whether Dumbledore's reasons for choosing them nonetheless justified the choice is a separate question, and one that I suspect you're better positioned to answer than I am. Amelia looked at her steadily. Would you be willing to submit a formal written statement of this account? Yes, Minerva said without hesitation. Whenever you need it. She signed the form that Amelia slid across the table and rode the Floo back to Hogwarts and sat at her own desk for a while without doing anything in particular. The grounds outside the window were dark by now, the snow coming down more steadily, and the light in the tower windows across the courtyard was the warm yellow light of students working or not working at the end of a Wednesday that had turned into a Thursday while she wasn't watching. Somewhere, in one of those lit rooms, Harry Potter was in his first term at Hogwarts. She had seen him sorted 2 months ago. He'd sat under the hat for nearly a minute, which the hat did not usually need, and into Gryffindor, which she had noted, and gone on with the ceremony because there was always a ceremony to go on with. She had made her choice on a cold November night 10 years ago, and had lived inside it ever since. It had felt at the time like deference to authority. She was no longer entirely certain that was the whole of what it had been. The difference was what it had cost someone else. She picked up her quill and began to write. He arrived exactly on time, which she had not expected, and alone, which she had. He was very tall, taller than she had understood from the formal correspondence, taller than a man of 110 had any right to carry off, with silver hair that fell past his shoulders and a silver beard that fell further, and half-moon spectacles perched on a nose that had been broken at some point in his very long history and had healed slightly crooked. His eyes, behind the spectacles, were blue, and they were not unkind, and they saw everything. He sat down across from her in the plain room on the DMLE floor and folded his hands on the table and waited. Amelia set the delivery report between them without comment. He picked it up and read it. He read it carefully and completely, which she had also expected, and when he set it down he sat for a moment with his hand still on the table, looking at nothing in particular, and then he said, "I can trust Hagrid with my life." He said it without sarcasm and without apology, and without the defensive quality she had learned to recognize in people who were preparing to explain themselves. He said it the way you say something that you have always known and are now simply confirming for the record. He filed the report himself, Amelia said. I don't believe anyone asked him to. No, Dumbledore said, they wouldn't have. It would have been his own idea. A gamekeeper's habit. You document what you move, where it came from, where it goes. He looked at the report a moment longer. He wrote it the same night. Yes. She opened the folder. I want to go through the findings from my investigation before I ask you anything. I'd like you to hear all of it. He inclined his head. She went through it in the order she had assembled it. Adjacent trace records, 11 notifications to 4 Privet Drive, I've over 10 years. 11 warning letters sent, no welfare officer visit, no follow-up of any kind. The accidental magic reversal squad report from Godric's Hollow, cross-referenced with the delivery report, together the first and only complete account of what had happened to Harry Potter on November 1st, 1981, placed side by side for the first time. The visit to Privet Drive, the woman who had answered the door, and the house that had been perfectly tidy, the cupboard under the stairs, the mattress, the shelf, the latch on the outside of the door. She described it without editorial. She had spent her career learning to describe things without editorial, and she knew that the things that required no editorial were the things you described most plainly. Dumbledore did not move while she spoke. He did not interrupt, and he did not argue, and he did not show the face of someone calculating what could be challenged and what could not. He sat and listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. I didn't know about the cupboard, he said. I knew the family was unsuitable. Minerva told me. I agreed with her assessment. He paused. I told myself they would manage, that the protection was what mattered, and the rest would follow. The rest didn't follow. No, he said, it didn't. He looked at the table. It was a cost I did not have the right to impose on him. You should know that I am aware of that. Amelia studied him for a moment. She had interrogated a great many people over the years, and she had learned that the ones who acknowledged wrongdoing cleanly and without bargaining were often doing one of two things. They were genuinely contrite, or they were sophisticated enough to understand that acknowledgement without evasion. She had not yet determined which this was, and suspected it was both. I'd like to understand your reasoning for the placement, she said. The full reasoning, he explained it. He explained it the way she imagined he explained everything, with the thoroughness of someone who had thought about it for a very long time, and had refined the explanation until every term was exact. Lily Potter had chosen to die, rather than step aside. That choice, the willingness to die for love of another person, to place herself between her child and death, had invoked magic so old and deep that it did not appear in the standard corpus. Her sacrifice had created a protective charm around Harry. The charm required a specific condition, that Harry live in a home where Lily's blood was present. Petunia Dursley was Lily's sister, her only living blood relative. The charm renewed itself each year when Harry returned. Without it, what remained of Voldemort would have had a clear path to the boy, and the boy was the only person who could ultimately face what remained of Voldemort, and so the charm was not incidental. He said all of this plainly. He did not make it grandiose. I understand the argument, Amelia said. It is not merely an argument, he said gently. It is what occurred. I understand that Lily Potter's sacrificial death created a protective charm that required Harry to live with her blood relatives in order to hold. She set her quill down. What I want to be clear about is this. The blood protection explains why Harry Potter lived in that house. It does not explain a child sleeping in a cupboard. Silence. No, Dumbledore said. It doesn't. She wrote that down. She wrote it precisely because she intended to read it back to him, and she needed the exact words. The placement was necessary. The conditions of the placement were not monitored and were not adequate. Those are two separate things. Yes, he said, they are. She allowed a moment to pass. Then she said, I want to ask you about Sirius Black. Something moved in the blue eyes. Not surprise. She didn't think surprise was something he experienced very often, but a quality of attention that sharpened. His motorcycle is in the delivery report, she said, which means, on the night the war ended, the most important night in a decade, Sirius Black was trusted enough by your side to have his motorcycle in Hagrid's hands, acting on your authority. She held his gaze. He was arrested the same night. He has been in Azkaban for 10 years without a trial. Why did you not question that? He did not look away. I believed he was the secret keeper, he said. Lily and James had gone into hiding under the Fidelius charm. The plan as I understood it, was that Sirius would be the secret keeper. He was the logical choice. He was their closest friend, and he would have died before betraying them. He paused. When I heard that 13 people were dead, and he was found laughing in the rubble, I believed it because it fit a pattern. I believed he had broken under the weight of the war. People break. I had seen it. But you were wrong. I was wrong, he said simply. I did not ask to see him. I did not ask how the arrest had been conducted. I believed the evidence as it was presented to me, and I did not look further. I was wrong to not question it. He said these sentences as though he had said them before to himself in the years since, which she suspected was exactly the case. I cannot tell you what the truth is, Madam Bones. I can tell you that I do not know it, and that I should have known it sooner, and that those two things are not excused by anything I have told you today. She closed her folder. Thank you, she said. That's all I need for now. He stood when she stood, which was a courtesy, and he left without making it dramatic, which was a different kind of one. She sat for a while after he had gone. Then she took a fresh sheet of parchment and wrote with great care a formal memo to the Wizengamot Administration Services. She noted that Sirius Orion Black had been imprisoned in Azkaban since November 1981. She noted that no trial record existed. She noted that, in light of documentation now in the possession of the DMLE, establishing Sirius Black's connection to the events of November 1st, 1981, and in light of the confirmed absence of any formal judicial process, a formal review of his imprisonment status was warranted. She folded the parchment. The memo tray turned it into a paper aeroplane. It sailed upward and was gone. On a North Sea island that the wind considered its own particular province, in a cell that was the same temperature inside as out, Sirius Black sat with his back against the stone wall and his knees pulled up and did not sleep, because sleeping was the thing the Dementors got to you through most efficiently. And he had learned this in the first year and had been holding to the lesson ever since. He was 32 years old, which he knew only because he counted birthdays the way you count the marks on a prison wall, not with hope, but because you need to know that time is still passing. He had turned 32 in November. He had turned every age he had turned in this cell, and none of the ages had changed anything. He did not think about James. He did not think about Lily. He did not think about the cottage, or the street, or the night, or the sound of his own laughter in the rubble which had been the wrong response to the wrong emotion at the wrong moment, and had looked, to everyone who arrived after, like exactly what it was not. He had learned not to think about any of this, because the Dementors were patient, and they were thorough, and they knew where the thoughts went, and they would follow them there. He thought, I am innocent. The Dementors could not reach that. They had tried. They had been trying for 10 years, and the thing that made it unreachable was that it was not a feeling. It was a fact. A feeling could be taken. A fact you had witnessed yourself was harder. He did not know that his name had been spoken at the ministry for the first time in 10 years. He did not know that a piece of paper with his name in it, a paper aeroplane, folded by an enchanted tray, fired through a pneumatic tube, had just left a desk on the DMLE floor and was on its way to the Wizengamot Administration Services. He pressed his back against the cold wall and listened to the sea. He was innocent. That was all he had, and for now, for tonight, it was enough to hold. The Wizengamot Administration Services sent its formal response to the review request on the 6th of January, which was the first working day of 1992. Amelia had the envelope on her desk when she came in at 8 o'clock. She recognized the seal and the weight of it before she opened it, and she opened it anyway, with the care she gave all correspondence that she already knew would not contain good news. The response confirmed, in the administrative language, that the office preferred above all other languages, that the imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black had been conducted without a formal trial. The record showed a detention order signed by the then senior official of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and a transfer manifest to Azkaban and the Azkaban reception record. The record showed that these documents had been condemned under emergency detention provisions in force during the immediate post-war period, applicable to cases where the arresting official deemed the threat to public safety. The record showed nothing else. No charge sheet, no hearing date, no legal representation, no verdict. She set the letter down and read it again. She had been head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement since 1990, which was when Cornelius Fudge had become minister and had asked her to take the post, and which was also when she had inherited everything that the post entailed, the Aurora office, and 10 years of decisions made by her predecessors, some of which she had reviewed and approved, and some of which she was only now learning about. She had not ordered Sirius Black's imprisonment. She had not been in this chair in 1981, and the person who had been in this chair in 1981 was no longer at the ministry and was not in any case the point. The point was what happened now. The point was always what happened now, because the now was the only thing she was responsible for. She took the WAS response and placed it on top of the full file, which had grown considerably over the past 2 months. The delivery report was at the bottom where it had started, Hagrid's large looping handwriting on standard incident paper, filed in 1981 and not opened again until November. On top of it, the Privet drive trace records, 11 notifications with 11 gaps where the follow-up should have been, the AMRS report from Godric's Hollow. McGonagall's formal witness statement, which was 3 pages of precise prose and read like a legal document because McGonagall wrote as though everything she produced might eventually be read into the record. A summary of Dumbledore's meeting with her in December, which she had written herself and which she had worded with more care than she usually spent on internal documents. And now, the WAS response, completing the picture. She sent a memo to the minister's office, requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience. Fudge's office was on the level above hers, and it was considerably larger, and it had a window that actually looked at the outside world via a magical aperture rather than an internal wall. He was behind his desk when she came in, wearing his characteristic lime green bowler hat and the expression of someone who had been hoping until the very last moment that the meeting would be cancelled. He had been minister for about a year. He was still, at this stage, the sort of minister who owled Dumbledore when he was uncertain, which was often. She had learned to account for this as a feature of the environment. She set the file on his desk. She did not make it dramatic. She gave him the summary she had prepared, 4 pages, distilled from 2 months of documentation, and she waited while he read it, which he did in the way that people read things they don't want to have read, slowly, rereading the same sentences. He set the summary down and looked at her. "Sirius Black killed 13 people," he said. "According to the record," she said, "he was placed in Azkaban for that. And I want to be precise about what the record shows, Minister, because precision matters here. The Ministry has no record of charging Sirius Black with any offense, no record of a formal hearing, no record of a defense submission or a waiver of defense. He was transferred to Azkaban under emergency detention provisions and has remained there for 10 years without any judicial proceeding of any kind." Fudge's face did the thing it did when he was working through the implications of something he found deeply inconvenient. It moved through several expressions without quite landing on one. "The post-war period," he said. "There were exceptional circumstances. Barty Crouch was running the DMLE. He operated with there were many arrests. Voldemort's supporters. I'm aware of the circumstances," Amelia said. She said it without impatience, because impatience was not useful here, and she had long since learned the difference between the urgency she felt and the register she projected. The emergency provisions existed for a reason, and many of the arrests conducted under them were appropriate. This one may or may not have been appropriate. In fact, we don't know, because there was no trial. She held his gaze. "My concern is not whether Sirius Black is guilty. My concern is whether the Ministry can document that it asked the question. You're saying we need to ask it now. I'm saying that we appear, based on the documented record, to have never asked it, and that this is now in a file in my department, which means it is documented, and that once something is documented, the question of what to do about it does not go away by itself." Fudge stood up, which he often did when a conversation required him to feel more authoritative, and walked to the window. The enchanted aperture showed a grey January sky, low and flat, with a suggestion of sleet. He looked at it. "I'll need to consult with Dumbledore," he said. "You may consult with whoever you like," Amelia said. "The absence of a trial record is not something Professor Dumbledore can alter." A pause. He might have insights into the situation, into the original circumstances, into whether Black was... He might. That would be appropriate for a Wizengamot review to hear. She picked up the summary page and set it closer to his end of the desk. "What I'm requesting, Minister, is straightforward. I'm requesting that this matter be formally logged as an anomaly pending Wizengamot review. Not a trial, not yet, a logging, a formal acknowledgement that the question exists and that we are aware of it." She paused. "The Ministry has been unaware of it for 10 years. I am suggesting that continuing to be unaware of it is not at this point an available option." He turned away from the window. He looked at the summary page. He looked at the file. He sat down slowly and picked up his quill. It took him 7 minutes to sign the requisite forms, which she had brought with her because she had worked with enough ministers to understand that if you left the forms for someone else to produce, the meeting ended and the forms were never produced, and then you had another meeting and you brought the forms to that one instead. She left with the signed documentation and the date of the first formal Wisengamot administrative log for Sirius Orion Black, January 1992, 10 years and 2 months after his arrest. The first time in all of that the question of his trial had been written anywhere in the ministry's official record as a question that required an answer. She took the stairs back to her floor rather than the lift, because the lift was slow and she had been sitting down for most of the morning and she thought better when she was moving. The corridor between the stairs and her office ran the full width of the DMLE floor, and the enchanted paper aeroplanes of the department's internal mail passed through it at intervals, banking around the corner at the far end with a neatness that she had always found slightly absurd. She watched 3 of them in sequence, a tight V formation, which meant someone had sent a batch simultaneously, and thought, as she had thought before and never quite finished thinking, about the infrastructure of paper. How much of what the ministry knew was in drawers it had not opened. How many files from 1981 and before were sitting in the sub-level archive, correctly filed, legally retained, never retrieved because no one had known to retrieve them. How many decisions had been made in the post-war chaos and then buried under the decade that followed, not hidden deliberately, but simply never looked for, because looking required someone to know there was something to look for. A gamekeeper's filing habit, a routine retention review. 10 years of sitting in the dark. She pushed the thought aside because she had enough on her desk and because following it to its conclusion would take longer than the afternoon she had. She went back to her office. She updated the 2-column parchment, which had by now expanded to several sheets, and she put the signed forms in the file, and the file back in its proper place. Then she sat down and wrote the formal request for a full Wisengamot hearing, with a date. The fire in Dumbledore's office had been burning since late afternoon, which meant the room was warmer than it needed to be by the time February dark settled against the windows, and he had not moved from the chair by the hearth in some time. The portraits of former headmasters were behind him. He did not look at them. He was aware of the small, restless sounds of their frames, the occasional sleeper shifting, the rare murmur of advice he had not requested. But he did not turn. He had been called to the ministry twice in 2 months. He had answered both summons without difficulty, because that was what you did when Amelia Bones wrote to you, and because he had understood. The moment he saw Hagrid's handwriting on the photostat Amelia had placed between them, that the difficulty would not lie in answering. It would lie here, in the chair, at the end of the day, when there was nothing left to be done, and the question was not what to say to a ministry official but what to say to himself. He thought about Sirius Black. He had known Sirius since Sirius was 11 years old, which was now over 40 years ago, and in those 40 years he had formed a view of Sirius that he had considered thorough, a boy of considerable gifts and equally considerable recklessness, who had grown into a young man who loved too fiercely and laughed too loudly and was entirely prepared to die for the things he loved. A man who had been so furious about his family's values that he had spent his adult life building a different kind of family out of the people the war kept trying to take from him. The plan had been that Sirius would be the secret keeper. Sirius had told him this, and Dumbledore had understood it, and had thought, of course it would be Sirius. There was nothing Sirius would not have done for James and Lily, and the fierceness of it was precisely why Voldemort would have gone for him first. He did not know they had switched. No one had told him. This was, he understood now, because the decision had been made to protect Sirius, to make him a false target, a decoy, and to let the deception hold as long as possible. He had not been told because knowing him might have been a risk. He had accepted, at the time, that James and Lily would not necessarily tell him everything. That was the nature of the Fidelius charm. The point was, and then the war ended on a night in October, and in the days that followed, he had not slept, and he had not eaten enough, and he had made arrangements and said what needed to be said, and set things in motion that he could not take back, and somewhere inside all of that, lawing. He had believed it. He had believed it because it fit the shape of the grief he was already inside. The war broke people. He had seen it too many times not to know the shape of it, the way the sustained proximity of death hollowed people out and left them capable of things they would not otherwise have been capable of. He had believed it because Sirius had never been quite stable in the way that people who had never been to war confused with strength, and because being wrong about someone you trusted was, in the exhaustion of that week, a smaller catastrophe than it would have been in any other week. He had believed it, and he had not asked to see Sirius, and he had not asked how the arrest had been conducted, and he had not asked what the evidence was beyond the bodies and the laughter. The question he had avoided for 10 years was simple. Could he have asked? He sat with it now. He let it be what it was, which was a question with a clear answer, and he did not choose the comfortable version of the answer. He could have asked. He had the standing, the access, the relationships necessary to ask. He had not asked, because the grief was very heavy and the war was over and there was Harry to think about, and the answer that was already in front of him. Sirius, guilty. Sirius broken. Sirius the one who broke was an answer that required nothing further of him. The other answer required something he had not had in him that week. He thought about what it cost to be the answer that required nothing further. He thought about the cell on the North Sea island, the cold, the 10 years of Dementors. He thought about what the Dementors did to people who had committed no crime. He thought, I knew Sirius when he was 11 years old, and I watched what the war did to him, and I believed the worst, and I did not ask. He did not look at the portraits. He thought about Harry. He knew what Harry's life at Privet Drive had been. He had known in the abstract, which was how he had permitted himself to know it, in the abstract, at the level of necessity. The protection required the address. The address required the family. The family was what it was, and Harry would endure it, and the protection would hold. Small for his age, very thin. The cupboard under the stairs, with the latch on the outside. He had told himself, safe. He had told himself, this is what safe looks like, and it is not comfortable, and he is a remarkable boy and he will be all right. He had allowed himself to believe that safe was the same as well. And he had done this deliberately, with the deliberateness of a man who understands what he is doing and does it anyway, because the alternative would require him to sit in a chair by a fire in February and know the difference. The difference was a mattress on the floor and a shelf and a door that latched from the outside. He sat with that too. The fire settled and the portraits slept, and he did not move. Severus Snape graded papers until 9 o'clock, which was his habit, and then he set the stack aside and sat in the cold room for a while. The potions classroom smelled the same way it had always smelled, something acidic, something organic, something that got into stone over years and did not leave. He had been in this room for 10 years. He was 32 years old, and he had been in this room for 10 years. And there were people who considered this a kind of failure, and he had never bothered to consider those people. He had heard through the channels that information moved through in a school, not gossip, which was imprecise, but the sharper current of things people didn't realize they were letting slip, that there was a ministry investigation, that it involved Dumbledore, that it involved the handling of Harry Potter and some piece of documentation from 1981. He understood immediately what this meant. Not the specific contents, those he didn't have, but the geometry. He understood geometry. If a ministry investigation trained its attention on every choice Dumbledore had made in the autumn of 1981, on every arrangement he had entered, and every person he had trusted, and every decision he had made in the hours after Voldemort's fall, the landscape of that investigation would eventually include him. Not as a subject, most likely, but as a shape that needed accounting for. A former Death Eater who had turned somehow, and who was now teaching at Hogwarts under the headmaster's protection, which had never been a secret exactly, but had also never been the kind of thing that invited documentation. He went to Dumbledore's office at 9:30. Dumbledore was by the fire. He had clearly been there for some time. He looked at Snape when he came in with the expression he always had, which was the expression of someone who had already thought through several versions of the conversation and was prepared for whichever one arrived. "You've heard," Dumbledore said. "Enough." Snape sat. He did not waste time on the middle of the conversation. "Amelia Bones. Yes, she'll be thorough. She will," Dumbledore said. "She is thorough, and she is fair. Both things." Snape looked at him. He was very good at reading Dumbledore, which was a skill he had developed over 10 years of close proximity and necessity. What he read now was not evasion, which he would have found alarming, and not false comfort, which he would have found insulting. What he read was accuracy. Dumbledore was giving him an accurate description of the situation. "If it comes to it," Snape said. "If it comes to it," Dumbledore said. "You are what you are, and you have been what you have been for 10 years, and that is the account you give. Nothing more and nothing less. Stay where you are, Severus. Be what you are." Snape said nothing for a moment. Then, "This is going to cost you something." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I believe it is. I assume you've decided that's appropriate." "I've decided it's accurate," Dumbledore said. "Whether it's appropriate is not mine to decide." Snape left him there by the fire, not looking at the portraits. Harry heard it in a corridor on a Thursday afternoon, from a cluster of fourth-year Ravenclaws who didn't notice him passing, something about the Ministry and Dumbledore and some kind of inquiry. One of them said his name, Harry's name, and then they turned the corner and their voices faded before he could make out what had come after it. He stood in the corridor for a moment. He was small and thin and 11 years old, and he had become, since September, accustomed to the fact that his name meant different things to different people, that it arrived with a weight attached to it that he had never put there. He had learned to mostly not notice this. He noticed it now. He went to Hagrid's. The hut was warm and smelled of something baking, and Fang launched himself at Harry's knees the second the door opened, which was comforting in a straightforward animal way that Harry had come to appreciate. Hagrid looked at him over the dog's head with a look that Harry couldn't quite read, which was unusual because Hagrid's face was generally readable at considerable distances. "All right, Harry," Hagrid said. "Yeah," Harry said. "I don't know." He sat down on the bench and let Fang put his enormous head in his lap. "Is something happening?" I heard. "I don't know what I heard. Exactly. Something about the Ministry and Dumbledore, and my name." Hagrid was quiet for a moment, a long one. "Can't say, Harry," he said. "Not can't say, meaning no. Can't say meaning the words weren't available to him yet, or weren't his to give. Can't say right now." He had known Hagrid for 6 months, which was not very long, except that it was the 6 months in which Harry had found out that he was a wizard, and that his parents had not died in a car crash, and that there was an entire world that he belonged to that had been running parallel to his life for 11 years without him knowing. 6 months with Hagrid counted for more than the arithmetic suggested. He nodded. He scratched Fang's ears. He stayed for another 20 minutes and drank tea that was too strong and didn't ask again, because Hagrid's face, when he'd said can't say, had been the face of someone who was keeping something that didn't fit easily inside him, and Harry had spent 10 years learning to recognize that face and not make things harder. He walked back up to the castle in the dark. He did not look at the scar in the mirror when he went to bed, because looking at it on bad-feeling days never helped, and he had figured this out in October. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling of the dormitory. Ron's snoring, Neville's quiet, the distant sounds of the castles settling, and he thought about the corridor and the voices he hadn't quite caught, and Hagrid's face. He was 11 years old. He was used to not being told things. He was also, he thought, in the dark, getting less used to it than he'd expected. He slept. The ministry summons arrived on a Tuesday in March, delivered by a large barn owl that managed somehow to look official, and Hagrid read it twice with the careful attention he gave anything written, which was the attention of someone who had learned to be thorough about written things because written things mattered more than people sometimes thought. Then he folded it, put it in his jacket pocket, and walked up to the castle. Dumbledore listened to him read it aloud. He sat behind his desk with the expression Hagrid had seen on his face when things were happening that needed to happen whether or not anyone wanted them to, which was an expression that managed to be both sorrowful and at peace with itself, in a way that Hagrid had never quite been able to manage but had always admired. "Tell her the truth," Dumbledore said when Hagrid finished. "Everything you remember from that night, tell her all of it." Is this going to cause you trouble, Professor?" A pause. "It already has," Dumbledore said. "That isn't your fault, Hagrid, and it won't be." Hagrid looked at him for a moment. He had known Albus Dumbledore for 50 years, which was longer than most people had known anything, and there was a quality in his voice just now that Hagrid had heard before and couldn't quite name, not exactly sadness, not quite regret. He nodded and went back down to his hut and pressed his good jacket and set off for London the next morning on the night bus, because he didn't have any other way to get there, and it was not until he was already on the bus that he realized he hadn't asked where the motorcycle was. The ministry meeting room was the same one, he learned later, that was used for all the significant conversations in this investigation. Small, rectangular, oil lamp, plain table, 4 chairs. He was aware, as he was always aware, in spaces that had been designed for people rather smaller than him, of the particular architectural, polite fiction that nothing was unusual. The chair he sat in did not quite break. The table was at the wrong height. He folded his large hands in front of him on the surface and tried to remember that he was here to be helpful. Madam Bones was not what he'd expected, which was fair enough. He was not usually what people expected, either. She was shorter than him by a considerable margin, which almost everyone was, and she had the kind of face that had made up its mind about things. She introduced herself, set out a parchment and quill, and said, "I want to begin by telling you that you're here as a witness. You haven't done anything wrong." He appreciated that. He wasn't always sure, in official settings, where he stood, and he appreciated it when someone told him clearly. "Right?" he said. "Yeah, all right." She asked him to confirm the report. He confirmed it the way he confirmed everything. One fact at a time, laid out in order, because the order mattered, and he didn't want to get anything wrong. November 1st, 1981. He had been sent by Professor Dumbledore to collect the infant Harry James Potter from the ruins of the cottage at Godric's Hollow in the West Country. He had found the cottage, or what was left of it, the east wall gone, the roof half down, and he had found the baby. James was on the floor in the hall. Lily was upstairs. He didn't say this last part with any particular expression, because he'd been carrying those images for 10 years, and he'd learned that if he let himself feel them in company, he would be entirely unable to function, and he needed to function right now. The baby had been sleeping. He'd had a fresh cut on his forehead, a strange shape like a bolt of lightning, already clotting. He'd wrapped him up properly and held him against his chest and got back on the motorcycle. Destination: 4 Privet Drive, Little Winging, Surrey. He gave Professor Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall the infant at the garden gate, and Professor Dumbledore placed the baby on the doorstep with a letter. And that was that, Madam Bones asked. And then what? Then he'd gone to the ministry, the sub-office near Charing Cross. He always filed a report when he transported something. A gamekeeper's habit: if you move a creature or a person, you document it. He'd done it the same night before going back to Hogwarts. She made a note. The motorcycle, she said. The form indicates it was borrowed from S. Black, Sirius, Hagrid said. He didn't mean to say it the way it came out, which was the way you say the name of someone you've been carrying around inside a complicated feeling for a long time. Sirius Black lent it to me. Young Sirius Black. He said the full version, because that was what he'd written, and what he'd written was what he'd said on the night. And it was the thing that had always mattered, even when he hadn't known yet. Why, she looked up from her parchment. Can you tell me about him? He looked at the lamp on the wall, because the lamp was easier than her face just at this moment. Sirius was. He was as good a man as I've known, he said. I don't say that to many people. He was part of the Order. He'd have done anything for James and Lily. For the cause, he stopped. He trusted Professor Dumbledore with everything, his life, his choices, everything. And we trusted him the same way back. He lent you the motorcycle that night without any hesitation. Without a thought, Hagrid said. That was Sirius. He didn't hesitate about things he was sure of. She wrote this down. Then she said, Did you know he was arrested that same night? No, he was back at Hogwarts by then. He'd cried himself to sleep, if he was honest, which wasn't something he said often, and he'd slept until afternoon, and by the time he'd heard, it had been the next day or the day after. The days had blurred. It was already done. Sirius was already in Azkaban, and you believed it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the meeting room in the corridor, he could hear the distant sounds of the ministry going about its business, the enchanted memo planes, the hum of people moving between floors. I believed it like everyone did, he said, because it was what we were told, and because, he stopped. He started again. Professor Dumbledore seemed to believe it too, and that mattered. What he believed mattered to me. I don't know if it should have, but it did. He said the last part quietly, and he didn't apologize for it. Madam Bones set her quill down. Mr. Hagrid, she said, you didn't do anything wrong by filing that report. He blinked. The thing about this room, this conversation, was that it had a quality of accumulated weight that he had been carrying for a while, without a name for it. And the sentence she had just said gave the weight a shape he hadn't expected. He pressed his fingers to his eyes for a moment, which was the best he could do under the circumstances. I know, he said, I know that he lowered his hands. I just do a report. When I transport, always have. Didn't seem right not to write it down. It wasn't right not to, she said. That's why we're here. He nodded. He wiped his face with his sleeve in the way that was the only practical approach available to him in rooms where handkerchiefs were architecturally insufficient. He thanked her when she said he could go. He was on the bus back to Hogsmeade before the thought fully arrived that a piece of paper he had filled out in the middle of the worst night of his life, in a ministry sub-office at 4 in the morning, out of professional habit and nothing else, had become the thing that had said Sirius's name somewhere official for the first time in 10 years. He pressed his face against a window of the night bus as it lurched through London, and he thought about that for a long time. Harry noticed he was gone before anyone mentioned it. He noticed in the way he noticed things, quietly, cataloguing the absence without meaning to. When 2 days passed, without a light in the hut window, when there should have been one, and Fang wasn't barking at the edge of the grounds at feeding time. The Gryffindor common room was warm, and the fire was going, and it was a Thursday evening, and most people were doing homework or pretending to. Neville Longbottom was sitting beside him with a herbology essay, and the expression of someone who was not currently being interrupted by anything and would prefer to keep it that way, which was an expression Harry had learned to read accurately in the 6 months they had shared a dormitory. "Do you think something's wrong with Hagrid?" Harry asked. Neville didn't look up from the essay immediately. "He's not here, is he?" "No." Neville considered this. "Things with the ministry are always more complicated than they say," he said, which was not an answer to the question Harry had asked, and was also somehow an answer to it. Harry looked at him. Neville had a round face, and the manner of someone who had learned to be matter-of-fact about things that other people found dramatic, which Harry had wondered about before, and was wondering about again now. It occurred to him, not for the first time, that he didn't know the full shape of what Neville carried. He knew the general outline, the parents who weren't gone, but weren't there, the grandmother, the long visits to a ward in a hospital that existed specifically for people who couldn't come back from what had been done to them. He didn't know what it was like to live inside that particular arithmetic. He thought, Neville knows something about waiting for the ministry to notice that something is wrong, about filing things away and not being told, about the gap between what the official record says happened and what actually happened to a person. He didn't say any of this. It wasn't the kind of thing you said in a warm, common room on a Thursday evening to someone who was trying to finish an essay. But he sat with it, the thought and the fire, and Neville's easy matter-of-factness, and he thought that there were worse things than having someone sitting next to you who already knew that the world was complicated and had decided to keep going anyway. Hagrid was back on Friday. Harry saw the light in the hut window at breakfast and felt the particular relief of a small thing restored. He didn't ask what had happened. He was getting better at knowing when not to ask. The inquiry convened on the 14th of April, in a chamber on the 3rd level of the ministry that was used for formal administrative proceedings rather than criminal trials, smaller than the main Wisengamot courtroom, plainer, without the elevated gallery, and the chains on the chair in the center. The chair in the center of this room was an ordinary chair. Amelia had specified this when she filed the chamber request, because the shape of a proceeding mattered to how people behaved inside it, and she had not convened a criminal trial. She had convened a formal inquiry, which was a different thing, and she intended the room to reflect it. The Wisengamot Administration Services was represented by 3 senior members who would hear the evidence and deliver findings. Cornelius Fudge sat to one side with the expression of someone who had eaten something that disagreed with him and was hoping no one would notice. Several other Wisengamot members were present as observers. Dumbledore sat not in the central chair, but to the left of it, which was where she had asked him to sit here, as the relevant party, not as a defendant. Amelia stood at the table. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, in full, in order, without emphasis that hadn't been earned. She set the documents on the table in the sequence she would present them, and began the delivery report. She described it, a handwritten document on standard DMLE incident paper, filed on the night of November 1st, 1981, by Rubeus Hagrid, gamekeeper at Hogwarts. She described the form of it. Large letters, uneven but legible. The author's habit of documentation, more useful than any formal training. She read the relevant entries aloud. The name of the child, the origin, the destination, the authorizing party, the vehicle. She read the vehicle entry in full and did not add anything to it. The trace record for 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey. 11 notifications of accidental magical incidents across 10 years. 11 warning letters sent to the address by the improper use of magic office. 0 welfare officer visits. 0 follow-up contacts. Professor McGonagall's formal witness statement, submitted in writing and read into the record. Her presence on November 1, 1981, in cat form from early morning. Her explicit, verbal objection to the Dursley placement made to the headmaster on the night. She read the relevant passage in McGonagall's own words, which were careful and precise and left nothing ambiguous. The Privet Drive, visit the house, the woman who answered the door, the cupboard under the stairs with the mattress and the shelf, and the outside latch, the letter Petunia Dursley had produced, and which Amelia had read and returned. The answer to her final question, had anyone from the wizarding world ever come to check on the boy, which had been no. She paused. That concludes the evidence on the matter of Harry James Potter, she said. I will now address the related matter which arose from the same document. She presented the Sirius Black evidence with the same methodical sequence. The delivery report named a motorcycle borrowed from S. Black, Sirius Orion. Black, who had been a member of the Order of the Phoenix, who had been trusted by Dumbledore and by the Order on the most significant night of the war, whose vehicle had carried the subject of the report from a death scene to his destination. Who had been arrested on November 1st or 2nd, 1981, the same night the report was filed. Who had been held in Azkaban continuously for 10 years, 4 months, and 14 days. For whom no charge had been formally filed, no hearing had been convened, no legal advocate had been recorded. The chamber was quiet. Albus Dumbledore rose when invited to speak. He was very tall and very old, and the room accommodated both of these facts without comment. He said that he wished to address the two matters separately, as Madame Bones had done, because they deserved to be addressed separately, and because conflating them would be imprecise. He made the blood protection argument. He made it fully and clearly, the way Amelia had heard it before. Across the table in the DMLE meeting room in December. Lily Potter's sacrificial death, its nature as an act of love, freely given in the face of clear harm, the ancient magic this had invoked, the charm it had created. The charm required a specific condition. It required Harry to live in a home where Lily's blood lived. Petunia Dursley was Lily's sister and only living blood relative. Without this arrangement, what remained of the Dark Lord? And he was explicit here and careful, stating that the curse's rebound had destroyed Voldemort's body, but that his soul had survived, diminished but extant, would have had a clear path to the boy. He said Harry Potter is alive today because of Lily's sacrifice and because the charm it created was maintained. He said this without asking for credit and without apology, because it was true, and because the truth of it was not the same as a justification for everything that followed from it. Wizengamot member, a woman with a pointed face, who had been taking notes throughout and had not yet asked a question, looked up. Does the blood protection, she said, require the child to sleep in a cupboard? No, he said. The charm requires that he live in the house, not in any particular room. Thank you, she said, and wrote something down. He turned to the matter of Sirius Black. I cannot offer a defense of the missing trial, he said, because there is no defense available to me that is also honest. He looked at the members of the administration services across the table from him, not at Fudge, not at the room. I believed Sirius Black was guilty. I had reasons for that belief which I have outlined previously in my written statement to Madam Bones. The reasons were the reasons I had, and they were not sufficient for what they justified in practice. A pause. I should have questioned my belief more rigorously. I should have asked to see him. I should have asked how the arrest was conducted. I did not do these things, and I am aware that my not doing them is part of the record now. He let that stand for a moment. A man's freedom, he said, should not rest on my willingness to credit his innocence. It should rest on a trial. That is what trials are for. The fact that no trial occurred is not something I can correct by re-examining my beliefs about it now. It is a procedural failure of the first order, and I offer no argument against addressing it. Amelia stood again. She said, "The pattern I want to name before findings are delivered is this in both matters: Harry Potter's placement and Sirius Black's imprisonment. A single individual's judgment was trusted in place of institutional process. In the first case, the headmaster of Hogwarts decided, without ministry consultation or documentation, where a child would live and on what terms. In the second case, the absence of a trial was not questioned by anyone who had the standing and the access to question it." She paused. "I am not suggesting that the intentions in either case were the same. I do not believe they were. I am saying that the same pattern of bypassing institutional process produced, on one hand, the protection of a child and his survival through 10 years of a diminished but extant threat, and on the other hand, the destruction of one man's decade, his freedom, his relationships, his name, in the absence of any finding that he had committed the acts attributed to him." She looked at the room. "Intention is not the same as consequence," she said. The inquiry's purpose was to document both. The senior member of the Wizengamot Administration Services thanked her and conferred briefly with his colleagues. Fudge watched this exchange with the expression of someone calculating how much of this would appear in tomorrow's Daily Prophet and what his face should be doing when it did. The findings were delivered in writing and read into the record. On the matter of Harry James Potter, his placement with the Dursley family was noted as having been carried out without ministry documentation or welfare registration. The blood protection argument submitted by Albus Dumbledore was accepted as the reason for his continued residence at 4 Privet Drive. A formal welfare monitoring order would be drawn up and served to the Dursley household, governing the conditions of Harry Potter's care during his remaining time there. He would stay. The monitoring would begin. On the matter of Sirius Orion Black, the documented absence of any trial record was formally entered into the Wizengamot's administrative register. The matter was referred to the full Wizengamot for a formal review of his imprisonment status at its next sitting. This was not a release, and the findings were careful not to describe it as such. The review would examine the procedural record, not the question of guilt, which the inquiry had not had before it and did not have standing to address. But the matter was open. For the first time in 10 years, 4 months, and 14 days, it was formally, officially, on record as open. The chamber emptied slowly, the way chambers emptied when people were uncertain how to arrange their faces. Fudge left without looking at Dumbledore, which said something, though Amelia wasn't sure yet what. The members of the administration services gathered their papers and filed out, professional and unhurried. Amelia and Dumbledore were the last 2 people in the room. She stood at the table, and he stood by the chair he had occupied, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The oil lamp on the wall gave a warm light that was not particularly suited to the occasion. "You did save him," she said. "The boy, he is alive because of what you did, the choice you made on November 1st, and the conditions you understood and maintained across 10 years." She looked at him. "That is also true. I want you to know." Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she might have called relief, except that it sat inside something more complicated than relief. A man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had just had it named with precision. "I needed someone to tell me it was not enough," he said. "I know," she said. She gathered the documents into the file. He held the door for her. They walked out into the corridor, and the ministry went on around them, paper aeroplanes banking and wheeling between floors, and the lamp in the chamber burned on alone until someone came to put it out. The note said, "Please come to my office at your earliest convenience." It was signed Professor McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, and it arrived at breakfast on a Tuesday in May, delivered by a school owl that dropped it beside Harry's porridge and left before he could decide what to feel about it. He went after breakfast. He wore the jumper that was too big for him. It had been Dudley's, and the sleeves still reached his knuckles if he didn't push them up. And he stood outside McGonagall's office door for a moment and tried to remember if he had done anything recently that warranted a summons. He couldn't think of anything with sufficient certainty. He knocked. She was behind her desk. She had the expression she wore when she had decided to say something difficult and had prepared for it, which was the same expression she wore when she had decided to say something kind and had prepared for that too. Contained, direct, the thin mouth in a firm line. She told him to sit, and he sat. "Mr. Potter," she said, "the Ministry of Magic has recently concluded a formal inquiry concerning your placement with your aunt and uncle." He looked at her. "My what?" "A document came to light in November," she said. "A report that Hagrid filed on the night he brought you to Privet Drive, describing the circumstances of the transfer. This document prompted a review of the conditions of your placement there, which was conducted by Madame Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The inquiry concluded last month." He was trying to hold the shape of what she had said, a document, a review, the words "concluded last month," and fit it against the thing he had been carrying since February, since the corridor and the fourth-year Ravenclaws and Hagrid's face saying "can't say right now." "You were there," he said. "On the night he brought me, something in her face shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly." "Yes," she said. "I was at Privet Drive that night. I had been watching the street all day. I was present when Hagrid arrived with you, and when Professor Dumbledore placed you on the doorstep." She looked at him squarely. "I raised concerns about the placement, about the family. I said that I had watched them all day and that I thought they were unsuitable." She paused. "Those concerns were not acted upon at the time. I want you to know that they were raised." He said nothing. He was 11 years old and had spent 11 years being told things that weren't quite the truth, or not told things at all, and he had become very good at being still, when information was coming in, at staying quiet enough to actually hear it. "What did Madame Bones find?" he said. McGonagall's hands were flat on the desk. "She visited Privet Drive," she said. "She spoke with your aunt. She saw where you slept, a brief pause, the only one she permitted herself. We know what your room was. We know that no one from our world came to ask after you in 10 years, not once. 11 warning letters from the Ministry about accidental magic incidents at that address, and not a single welfare officer following any of them." She met his eyes. "That was wrong. I want to say that plainly to you. It was wrong, and it should not have happened, and someone did eventually come looking 10 years late, and I am sorry that it was not sooner." Harry looked at the middle distance, which was the bookshelf behind her desk for a moment. "Why didn't anyone come before?" he said. "That," McGonagall said, "is a question that several people will be answering for some time." He nodded slowly. He thought, "That's not an answer. That's the honest version of one." "Is it sorted now?" he said. Whatever it was, she considered this carefully, the way she considered everything. "It will be better," she said. "That is what I can say to you honestly. The outcome of the inquiry means that the conditions of your time at Privet Drive will be properly overseen going forward." She paused. "You will not return to a cupboard, Harry." He blinked at the bookshelf. "Right," he said. "Okay." He stood. He found, to his own surprise, that his hands were steady. "Thank you, Professor." He went to Hagrid's. He knocked on the hut door and waited. Fang started going immediately, which was comforting, and Hagrid opened the door with an expression that shifted from welcome to something more complicated when he saw Harry's face. "Someone told you," Hagrid said. "Professor McGonagall," Harry said. "Can I come in?" He sat on the bench with Fang's head in his lap, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Hagrid was making tea with the particular concentration of someone who needs to do something with their hands. May sunlight came through the small window and lay in a stripe across the table. "You filed a report," Harry said. Hagrid set down the kettle. "I always file a report when I transport," he said. "Always have done. It's habit you document what you move, where it came from, where it goes. I didn't know anyone would ever—" He stopped. "I didn't know anyone would find it. I'm glad someone did," Harry said. Hagrid made a sound that was not precisely words, and then he sat down heavily on the other side of the table, and his eyes went very bright, and Harry watched this happening with the mixture of helplessness and warmth that Hagrid's emotions tended to produce in him. They were so large, so entirely transparent. "Hagrid!" Harry said. Hagrid put his large hands over his face. "Hagrid! Fine," Hagrid said, which was obviously not true. "Stop," Harry said. Hagrid removed his hands from his face. He looked at Harry across the table with an expression that was doing several things at once, and Harry looked back at him with an expression that he was keeping as steady as he could, because someone needed to be steady in this room, and it was clearly going to have to be him. "I'm all right," Harry said. "You know I'm all right now." He looked at his hands, which were thin and had knobby knuckles and were resting easily in Fang's fur. "I've been here since September. Something's I don't know. It's different here." He thought about the common room and the four-poster and the warmth of the great hall and Hagrid's hut and Quidditch and even potions, which he hated, but which was still something happening in a place where he was supposed to be. "I'm all right." Hagrid wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. "Yeah," he said in a voice that was thick with something he was trying to get past. "Yeah, all right. The tea's boiling," Harry said. Harry sat with Fang and the May sunlight and let the silence do what it needed to do. In the herbology greenhouse at the far end of the grounds, Neville Longbottom was alone with his plants, which was where he had been for the better part of an hour, and where he intended to remain until dinner. The mandrakes were doing well. They had been repotted earlier in the year. That had been a proper class the whole first year in earmuffs, and the ones on Neville's end of the bench had, since then, developed at a noticeably faster rate than most of the others. He knew this because he checked every time he was in here, because checking things you tended was the natural extension of tending them. You grew something, you watched it, you noticed whether it was responding. He had heard enough about the ministry inquiry to understand its general shape. A document had surfaced, someone had looked at it, and then a chain of events had followed that required a number of people to account for a decade they had thought was already dealt with. He had not asked Harry about it. It hadn't seemed like the kind of thing to ask about. He understood, in the way you understand, things you have never had words given to you for, what it was to be a person the ministry had not looked for. Nobody had come to his grandmother's door, not after the trial. Not during the visits to the ward at St. Mungo's, where his mother and father were in beds that were very clean and very quiet, and where his mother sometimes gave him Drooble's best blowing gum wrappers that she collected from somewhere because she still remembered the way you remember things. That there was a boy who visited and that the boy mattered to her. Nobody official had knocked on the door and said, "This child has had a considerable amount taken from him. We thought we'd check how he was managing." He was managing. He was at Hogwarts, which was the best place he had ever been, and his grandmother wrote him letters on Tuesday mornings, and his plants were thriving, and he was managing. But nobody had come to ask. He lifted a mandrake tenderly from its pot, checked the root system, replaced it with the care that the work required, and settled the soil back around it with his hands. The greenhouse was warm and green, and smelled of earth and growing things. He brushed the soil from his palms and moved to the next one. He tended his plants very carefully. At dinner, Harry sat down beside him without ceremony, and took a bread roll and did not say anything particular, and Neville did not say anything particular in return, and they sat there together in the noise and warmth of the great hall at the end of a Tuesday in May. The food was good. The candles were lit. Across the hall, Gryffindor had won something at Quidditch recently, and someone was being loudly enthusiastic about it. 3 seats down. That was enough. For now, for tonight. That was enough. She signed the welfare monitoring order on a Thursday morning in June, with the ministry seal and the careful signature she had used on official documents for 30 years. She signed it twice, once on the order itself and once on the copy that would go to the permanent record. And she set them flat on the desk and let the ink dry before she touched them. The order was precise, as she had written it to be. A welfare officer from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement would attend 4 Privet Drive, Ive Little Whinging, Surrey, at the commencement of each summer period for the duration of Harry James Potter's minority. Harry Potter was to occupy a proper bedroom with a door that opened from the inside. The cupboard under the stairs was not to serve as accommodation for any person. N. The family was to be informed that the arrangement was now under formal oversight, and that reports would be filed with the ministry following each visit. The blood protection remained in effect. The address remained the address. He would go back there in 2 weeks when term ended and the summer would begin, and this time there would be a welfare officer at the door before the end of June. She set her quill down. Through the magical aperture in her office wall, the London sky was a pale, clear blue that was doing its best given the season. She had not had many cases that stayed with her in quite this way. Most cases stayed in the file, and she moved to the next one, which was the only tenable approach to the volume of work that came across a head of department's desk in any given year. This one had taken 7 months from the first opened box to the signed order. This one had a gamekeeper's handwriting in it. The serious Black Review was proceeding through the Wisengamot's administrative process, which was not fast and was not designed to be. A formal advocate had been assigned, a witch from the Wisengamot administration services who had a reputation for exactness, and she was working through the procedural record with the thoroughness the case required. The review would take time. Months, likely, possibly longer. The truth about Peter Pettigrew was not in any ministry file, because Peter Pettigrew was believed to have died on a street in London on November 2nd, 1981, killed by Sirius Black, leaving behind a finger and a rat. The finger was documented, the death was documented, the rat was not. Sirius Black had been imprisoned for a violence he had apparently committed and for 12 others he had certainly committed, and the question of whether any of this was true had been entered for the first time into the official record of his life. That was what the review was. Not exoneration, not release, not the answer. The question. The door cracked open. It would take the truth, finding its own way out before the door could open all the way. And the truth was in places the ministry did not know to look and could not find yet. But the door was cracked. That was not nothing. Sirius Black in his cell on the North Sea Island did not know this yet. He would not know it for some time. He would not be freed by this inquiry, and when the truth came, when it came in its own way, in its own time, through means no one had yet imagined, it would arrive the way truths that have been suppressed for a long time arrive suddenly. But the ministry's record of his life had changed. Something had moved in it very slowly, after 10 years of stillness. The archive had his name in a new folder now, in a drawer that would stay open. In his office at Hogwarts, Dumbledore received the copy of the Welfare Monitoring Order at mid-morning, delivered by a ministry owl that accepted a piece of toast from the dish on his desk and departed without requiring anything else. He read the order through carefully. He folded it and set it on the corner of his desk, where it sat with the same square precision as the owl post always had when it contained something that needed to be given its proper weight. He opened the center drawer and took out the letter he had begun several weeks ago, the night after the Wisingamot hearing, and had not finished until tonight in his head. He read it through. He picked up a quill. He wrote the last paragraph, which was the hardest one, and which said what it needed to say in the most accurate language he could find. That a certain matter concerning his time at Privet Drive had been formally addressed by the ministry, and had acted on what they found, and that he was sorry it had taken 10 years for anyone to look at all. He said that the looking was not his doing. He said it had been done by someone with a better habit of looking at things than he had shown himself to have. He did not say everything. He set down the quill. He read the letter again. He folded it and put it back in the drawer. Harry was 11 years old, and he had been through a considerable amount this year, and he would be going back to Privet Drive in 2 weeks. The letter would be there when he came back in September, or in the year after. Dumbledore looked at the drawer for a moment and recognized, with the particular honesty he had been practicing since November, the quality of what he was doing. He was still deciding when Harry was ready. He was still the one making that decision. He noticed this, and set it alongside everything else he had noticed about himself since winter, and did not dismiss it. He closed the drawer. He looked out the window at the June grounds, which were green and very bright. Amelia held the original delivery report for a moment before she filed it. The paper had softened at the edges from handling. She had read it many times since November, had photostated it for the inquiry, had laid it beside the AMRS report, and seen them speak to each other across a decade of silence. It felt different now than it had when she first pulled it from the November 1981 stack. Not more significant, because it had always been significant, but more settled, as though it knew where it was going. The handwriting was large and looping slightly uphill toward the right margin, the pressure of the pen heavier than was strictly necessary for the medium. She looked at the entry for the child's name, Harry James Potter. The H was slightly larger than the letters that followed it, just fractionally, as though whoever had written it had pressed a little harder at the start and then remembered to ease back. She thought of a man sitting at a narrow table in a ministry sub-office at 4 in the morning, writing the facts of the worst night of his life in the only way he knew how to write them, which was carefully and one word at a time. It had cost him nothing. It had been habit, a professional reflex from someone who did not know and would not know for 10 years that the reflex was the thing that mattered. She opened the permanent record. She filed the delivery report as the originating document, attached to the case designated Potter Harry James. Welfare Review opened the 1st of November 1991, resolved June 1992. The names in the file were the names of the people who had been part of this: Hagrid's, the largest, Dumbledore's, McGonagall's, in her formal witness capacity, Amelia's own, as the head of department who had opened the inquiry. Amelia Bones, who had conducted a decennial retention review and found a piece of paper that had been sitting in the wrong drawer for 10 years, and had read it twice. She closed the file. She placed it in the permanent archive. The case was done. Harry was in the grounds on a Thursday afternoon in June, when the end-of-year feeling came over the castle the way it always did, all at once, like a change in the air pressure. He could feel it in the way the other students were moving. Looser, louder, the specific energy of people who had been contained in one place for 9 months and were about to stop being contained. He had his robes on and his shoes were untied, and he had been somewhere he couldn't quite remember now, because the afternoon had gotten away from him, which happened sometimes. He knew that Hagrid had filed a report. He knew that McGonagall had been there on the night watching, and had said what she thought, and had been overruled. He knew that Amelia Bones, whose name he had not known in November, and knew now, had opened a box of archived files and found a piece of paper, and had followed it all the way to a hearing and a formal order, and his name in a permanent record at the ministry. He knew that when he went back to Privet Drive in 2 weeks, someone would come in June to check. He knew that the answer to why didn't anyone come was being answered by people who would be answering it for a long time. He knew that was not the same as a good answer. He thought it was probably the honest one. He ran toward the lake. His robes billowed behind him, and the grass was warm, and the sky was the kind of blue that made the rest of the year feel like a preparation for this particular afternoon, and he was 11 years old, and very thin, and not much bigger than he'd been in September. And he ran anyway, because the lake was there, and the grounds were his, and the year was ending, and something in his chest, very slowly over the 9 months he had been here, had begun to assume a shape he recognized. At 4 Privet Drive, Ive, Little Whinging, Surrey, in a perfectly tidy house, on a perfectly ordinary street, the cupboard under the stairs stood empty. The door was open. Not latched. The latch was there on the outside where it had always been, but it was not drawn across. The mattress was gone. The shelf was bare. The small drawing pin in the corner held nothing now. Just a cupboard. Just a space under a staircase in an ordinary Muggle house, empty in the June light, the door standing open, no